Hi everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranawardi. I'm board member for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. We are very honored to have Walter Benn Michaels, professor of English at University of Illinois in Chicago, and Adolph Reed Jr., professor emeritus of political science at UPenn, to talk about their latest scholarly work, Race versus Class, No Politics but Class Politics. And we have sent the link to this book and a discount code for our alumni. And if you don't have it, don't worry, we will send it again. You can find it on our website as well. And their conversation, and this would be in a conversation with Lily Jamali, who is a senior reporter at Marketplace. I would like to take a few, brief moment to introduce our speakers, but I encourage everyone to check our website for their full bios. Walter Benn Michaels is an influential scholar in the fields of literary theory and American literary history, and also a high-profile polemicist whose political writings have appeared in publications such as the American Prospect and London Review of Books. Among his books are The Trouble with Diversity, How We Learn to Love Identity and Ignore Inequality, and The Beauty of a Social Problem of Photography, Autonomy, and Economy. Adolph Reed Jr. is a veteran activist and a prolific analyst of the politics of race and class. Among his books are Stirrings in the Jug, Black Politics in the Post-Segregation Era, and Class Notes, Posing as Politics. His essays have appeared in The Nation, Harper's, and Jacobin, among other publications. Last but not least, our host, Lily Jamali, is a senior reporter for Marketplace, covering business and economy at the American Public Media. The Marketplace, as I mentioned. Before that, she spent 3 years as a co-host and correspondent at KQED's The California Report. Lily holds degrees from Columbia's School of Journalism, NYU Stern, as well as a degree in English from UCLA. So without further ado, Lily, I send it to you.
Thank you so much for that, Kambiz. As I've been preparing for this panel over the last few weeks, I keep thinking of a show that we have at Marketplace called This is Uncomfortable. And it's a show about how money messes with our lives. And I've been thinking about the title a lot, mostly because of the conversation we're about to have can be uncomfortable for a lot of us. In their new book, No Politics but Class Politics, Walter Benn Michaels and Adolph Reed Jr. are making an argument that really challenges some of the constructs that many of us, myself included, have adopted to make sense of the world that we live in. My thanks to the Columbia Club of DC for organizing tonight's conversation. I'm so excited to dive in. I'm going to be speaking with Walter and Adolph for the first part of tonight's discussion, but we invite all of you in the audience to post questions in the Q&A. We're going to try to answer as many of them as we can over the course of this evening. So Walter and Adolph, a warm welcome to both of you and congratulations on this book.
Oh, thanks for having us. Yep.
I wanted to begin tonight by giving our audience a glimpse into your backgrounds and your relationship. Adolph, you are described in the book's introduction as having run in radical circles in your university days at UNC Chapel Hill. You spent several years as an organizer and in the administration of Atlanta's first Black mayor. And I was wondering if you could just begin by talking us through how those experiences steered you into academia and how you decided to use that as a lens to tackle the issue of inequality.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because I've said this elsewhere, but I come from an academic family, right? So when I was a little kid, I remember at 6 or 7, when people would ask me what I wanted to do when I grew up. I'd tell them, well, first I'm going to go to high school, and then I'm going to go to college, and then I'm going to get a PhD, and then I'll be a fireman. So it was just always kind of in the background that I was going to be an academic or at least go to graduate school. That education didn't stop till the doctorate. And I wound up, it wasn't clear when I was going to do it, right? I mean, first I had to graduate from college, which I had a little bit of, which took a little bit of effort. Like I left after a cafeteria strike for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years actually, and was out organizing. and then went back and graduated. And I decided to go to graduate school because it was already clear to people like me that that what we'd expected the new left to become wasn't going to happen, right? And that we lost, basically. And some viewers might find it kind of interesting to hear that, like, so I went to graduate school in the fall of 1972, and by that point, it was already clear to me, and I wasn't alone, that our side had lost, basically. And I've just been around here ever since.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to that with you, but
yeah.
I also want to bring Walter into the discussion. Tell me about your path and why you chose this topic as, something you wanted to devote so many years writing about and engaging with other academics on. What brought you to,
Well, Adolph is a political scientist and has always been working on this. I actually was and am a literature professor. I wrote a book, though, in the 1990s called Our America, Nativism, Modernism, and Pluralism. It really just originated out of trying to teach some of the sort of central American texts of the 20s. So, think about The Great Gatsby, The Sun Also Rises, maybe a less well-known but very brilliant one like Willa Cather's The Professor's House. And in reading through those texts, I realized the degree to which something I hadn't really noticed before, and it turned out many others hadn't. They were sort of structured, certain version of American racism. That it was in 1924 that the Johnson Immigration Act was passed, which really racialized American citizenship for everybody. Mm-hmm. It wasn't repealed until 1964. And you can see, in a certain sense in those texts, anti-Semitism plays a more central role than it actually ever did in American life. But I just saw the importance of race. And in the course of writing it, I was struck also by the degree to which, even in the 20s, the arguments for scientific racism had begun to fade. But instead of people giving up on the idea of race, they were actually increasingly committed to race. In the 20s, it took the form of culture. It would later on take the form of the so-called, and in my view, non-existent social construction of race. And in the course of writing it, I thought, it's interesting that that really we have this kind of racist literary history and, of course, a racist history. We have this kind of critique of the very idea of race, but even from the people who are deeply anti-racist, there's been a kind of commitment to hanging on to the idea of race. So I wrote a little bit sort of at the end of that book in a kind of afterword called the no drop rule about the degree to which race remained central, was becoming actually in the 90s increasingly central in American cultural discourse. And part of the argument I made, it was just like, really was just asking myself, so why is it? It's like Adolph and I both had hit on this example independently. When people realized there were no such things as no biological entities as unicorns, no one said, but what about the social construction of the unicorn? So you're thinking, when we realized there are no such biological entities as races, why was everybody not only keen to hang on to race, but actually in the sort of mid-90s, doubling down on race? And when you put it that way, the answer was kind of like obvious. It was because people were much more interested in talking about race, racism, and racial difference and racial inequalities than they were talking about economic inequalities, than they were talking about class. So from my standpoint, I really came at this topic through literary history. I wasn't thinking of it as a political topic primarily in the first place. But once you began to just think about that literary history, you were sort of inevitably driven toward the sense in which the kind of covert message. If you think about a novel like Great Gatsby, and I'm assuming that we're talking to a bunch of Columbia people here. I can't see you on the screen, but if you haven't read The Great Gatsby, you're not even supposed to admit it. Everybody's still supposed to read it. So if you think about Gatsby, the whole thing about it is that in one sense, it's the kind of American dream thing, and it is a class story. But the whole point about Gatsby is he can't escape his past. You remember, he actually has changed his name. His name was originally Jimmy Gatz. It's as if even in Gatsby, his economic origins, which is to say working class, are rewritten as racial origins. And his race sticks with him all the way through the novel. So I just began to think that it was a kind of crucial thing about modern American history, that our interest in race was increasingly, but had always been in a way from the start, an interest in class. And I wrote that in 1995, and Adolph and I met, actually, as a consequence of his being in a class where he taught that book. He and a colleague of ours to whom this book is dedicated, Ken Warren, who's an African-Americanist at University of Chicago. And we realized that we had strong predilections for the same way of thinking about this set of problems.
Very good. Well, I came of age in the 90s, which you mentioned is a time where the conversation really shifts and the notion of race and this construct becomes really prominent. And it's, I talked about this is uncomfortable at the beginning because the notion that race is a, as you put it, a non-existent social construction, that's got to be tough for a lot of people to process. Can you talk a little bit about that? Either of you can pick up on this thread, but that's a very provocative thing for a lot of people. It might be something that in social science circles is more ubiquitous, but I think in the mainstream, we don't hear that all the time.
So well, go ahead. One thing is Adolph and I can't see each other. I can't see Adolph and he can't see me, so I don't know who's talking first.
I can see you.
You can see me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll do 2 seconds on this.
Yeah,
here's a really quick way of thinking about it. When people gave up the biology of race, they went for the social construction of race. So what's the social construction of race? The best example is Du Bois. Du Bois says, look, a black man is a man who has to ride Jim Crow south of the Mason-Dixon line. So what do you think, what the people who are making black men ride Jim Crow south of the Mason-Dixon line, what do they think? They think that there's a biological, spiritual thing inside you, on your skin, everywhere through you, that is race. So we all learned a long time ago, that's not true. So we then said, no, but the point is race isn't a biological entity, it's a social construction. So what is social construction? Social construction is saying, well, we know that there is no such thing as a biological entity called race, but we actually are still going to treat people as if they belong to races. In other words, we know it's a mistake, but we actually are now going to make that mistake over and over again without, however, acknowledging the kind of biological part. So the point has been is that you needed race as a kind of form of social organization, but actually we have no coherent account of what race is, except race consists of people looking at people, treating them as if they were biologically different, even though we know, or at least those of us who think that there is no such thing as race, know that actually they are not biologically different. So the point was always, many people used to write, is race a biological entity or a social construction? And what we've been saying right from the start is it's neither a biological entity nor a social construction. It's a mistake. And we just ought to stop making the mistake.
Adolph, did you want to pick up of any of the things that Walter just said?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, I guess first thing I'll say is that the notion that race was understood fundamentally as a biological category is itself not accurate historically. It was for a minute, right? For the moment that we think of now as like the period of scientific racism or the heyday of scientific racism, but which is really roughly from the last quarter of the 19th century through the first quarter of the 20th century, more or less, depending on where you were. It obviously, lasted a little longer in Germany and in Mississippi than it did elsewhere. But the point was never really that race is a taxonomy of hierarchy, right? Like a social hierarchy based on ascriptive characteristics. That is what people supposedly are rather than what they do. And in that sense, race has always been an ideology that functions like gender, that functions like during the teens and the 20s of the last century as in the same way that feeble-mindedness did. And in fact, there's a great quote from Henry Grady, who was the principal avatar of the New South movement in the 1880s, who said in one of his speeches, he insisted that white supremacy had to be the cornerstone on which the new Southern industrial order had to be built. And he went on to say that it had to be the cornerstone because white supremacy is true, is correct, based in nature. But even if it weren't true based in nature. It had to be because we need for it to be. And that's kind of what race has always been. Even when biological race is being challenged, and I mean, I'll tell you an anecdote here, that a couple things happened in the span of a few months that sort of turned me to this area, or to this topic as a research interest. Like, I'm a historian of ideologies is one of the hats that I wear in political science. And in the summer of 1991, I was retained as a consultant to a committee at Yale. This is right before I left. That was funded, I forget who funded them now, but to support mainstreaming race and gender into courses that they taught in this elite major. And at one point, a colleague asked me how I would distinguish between race and ethnicity. And it hadn't come up before. So I said, well, I don't know, you think about it, like you can imagine a continuum of okayness. And if you're part of a group that's considered perfectly all right, you don't have any either race or gender. If you're a little farther out, you have ethnicity. If you're farther out still, you have race. Well, it's kind of made sense in 1991. It's not the best way to think about it now, obviously, or even then, frankly. But what struck me was how my colleagues responded. Several of them, I mean, not all of them, but a few of them said, no, wait, there's got to be a more significant difference than that. And that's when you start hearing the sort of Victorian race theory or premises of Victorian race theory coming at you from a bunch of, sterling professors at Yale, right? I mean, which was kind of striking. And I said at one point, so what, are you telling me that if I have a Polish grandmother and you have a Polish grandmother, like we walk into the cafeteria and we can sense that and we're drawn to each other? It's ridiculous. All right. So then several months later, I got invited to consult with a group at Brown who were putting together an ethnic studies major. And it's a bigger group. And I wound up getting the same question from in a much larger group of people. I gave the same answer and had the same kind of responses that, well, no, there's got to be something more than that. So I thought, well, so all these people believe in race, like they can stand up and talk about social construction, until the cows come home, right? But they all believe that race is real, right? In fact, as Walter argues powerfully in both Our America and in an article he spun off called Race into Culture, that the shift from biological race to cultural race was, first of all, as I said, it was a shift back to what race had been prior to the scientific fetishism of the Victorian era. But his point was that it's once race becomes understood as culture, and culture is understood as a property of groups, then culture is just race, without the unnecessary hazard of biology. And in fact, what one of the greatest racists of the first 3 decades of the 20th century, someone who on the Walter and I have probably read more of than anyone else alive, Lathrop Stoddard, actually made that argument that the beauty of race as culture or cultural pluralism is that I don't have to prefer my kind because they're superior. I just have to prefer them because they're mine. And that's basically the understanding of race that we've been operating with ever since. And certainly in the academy for the last 3 decades plus, saying race is a social construction is a mantra, at least outside the natural sciences and business schools. But people say it and they don't give any thought to what it would mean. And in fact, to the deeper point that, well, yeah, it's a social construction, but it's a social construction in the same way that a unicorn is a social construction, which is a polite way of saying it's a fiction.
And you make the argument in the book that Jim Crow was about there's this assumption out there that Jim Crow was really about white supremacy, when in fact, it was fundamentally about economics. And the association with white supremacy is so ingrained for so many of us. I wonder if you can just explore that a little bit.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, you could say, I mean, first of all, it's about both, right? Right. You don't have to have, right. Even though I'm technically like a social scientist, I don't believe you have to have monocausal explanations, right? So on one level, I mean, Jim Crow regime was obviously about race and about and white supremacy, right? It was like the planter merchant capitalist class had lived in what I even thought for a long time what was an irrational fear of the possibility of a political alliance between blacks, right, freed blacks, and working class whites and farmers. Turns out it wasn't all that irrational a fear. There were instances of that alliance having success at the ballot box and elsewhere, like even before the populist uprising. But when the populist insurgency came throughout the region, right, I mean, that was too much. And that's when, in one state after another, you know, violence, fraud, torture, murder, justified by calls for white supremacy and protection of white womanhood, but they were just as brutally enforced on white workers and white Republican voters and populist farmers as they were on blacks. Like, the point was that the black presence and the existence of white supremacy as an ideology, as a rhetoric and as a social structure, was like a cover story. Like, I've lately been describing it as the equivalent of a pickpocket's dodge, right? I mean, hey, look, there's a black guy over there, right? And don't pay any attention to that odd feeling in your inside pocket. But that's what, so in that sense, white supremacist rhetoric, and that's not to diminish lynching or the brutality or the evils of racial segregation or sharecropping one bit, but it wasn't pursuit, or the Jim Crow order wasn't imposed simply for the sake of imposing it. And in fact, as some black conservatives argued at the time, that the reason that the Democrats, who are the party of white supremacy, I've often said, I'll say it now for your audience too, that it was a toss-up as to whether, you know, we should understand the Democratic Party in the 1880s and 1890s South as the above-ground wing of the Klan, or the Klan as a provisional wing of the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party in the South was utterly, totally committed to white supremacy, and therefore, in part, committed to disfranchisement of almost all black voters. But as some black conservatives argued at the time, and this is something for us to keep in mind as we think about the problem of voter suppression today, well, it was the argument that the Democrats wanted to disfranchise blacks, not simply because they were black, but because they voted for the wrong side. And the black conservatives like Washington and the novelist Sutton Griggs argued that blacks should diversify the vote and vote in substantial numbers for Democrats. And if they did, it's quite likely, not that white supremacy wouldn't exist, but that race-based disfranchisement would not have been one of the mechanisms through which the objective of the white supremacist order was pursued. But does that make sense? So from that perspective, segregation, disfranchisement, white supremacy were certainly the everyday substance of the Jim Crow order that people felt and lived through, and it certainly constrained life chances and whatnot. But that was never really simply the point.
Right, and I think the pickpocket example that you give is for me, having read the book now, a really interesting lens to look at the theme through, because in a very reductive sense, the story, the book is somewhat about distraction. And although I don't think that term is used in the book itself, it's the argument that the focus, this intense focus on racial disparities, can lead people who genuinely want to rectify social injustices to focus on the wrong thing.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, well, I think that is true, but there's a way in which it's true and a way in which it's not true. Because, when you say people who genuinely want to rectify social injustices, that a lot of people, actually almost everybody, will describe themselves as genuinely want to rectify social injustice. I mean, look, the big question is, which social injustices do they want to rectify? So, I mean, a way to put this, right, would be to say that if you think that fundamental injustices of American society are racism and sexism and homophobia, that is to say, if you think that, then you think a fundamental problem is discrimination. Mm-hmm. And anti-racism, anti-sexism, and anti-homophobia are the way to go. I mean, the important thing about that is to recognize that, and while Adolph and I think everybody else who remotely describes themselves as being on the left or liberal, are all committed to the idea that absolutely it's the case that anti-discrimination should be pursued. Mm-hmm. But the fundamental thing about that is that if you succeeded in doing that, right? Suppose we imagine like a world in which we actually obliterated racism, sexism, et cetera, et cetera. And suppose we actually imagine that we've obliterated the kind of the historical consequences of previous racism and sexism. You wouldn't actually change economic inequality at all. I mean, right now, Black people are overrepresented in the bottom quintile of American income and wealth and underrepresented at the top. So something like 20% maybe in the bottom, 5 or 6% on the top. If you actually succeeded in eliminating all the vestiges of discrimination and current discrimination, Black people would be like 13.2% in the top, and they'd be 13.2% in the bottom. But a bunch more white people would be at the bottom, fewer white people would be at the top. A bunch more Asians would be at the bottom, fewer Asians would be at the top. But actually, the fundamental economic structure of the society would be left completely untouched. You'd have different skin colors at different strata, but you'd have. So when you say people who want to eliminate social injustice, I'm going to say, well, which social injustice do you want to eliminate? If you're worried about actually the increasing gap between the rich and the poor, no amount of anti-discrimination, no amount of anti-racism and anti-sexism will actually make any difference to them. It makes a difference to who is where, but it doesn't make a difference to the gaps. If you're actually interested in eliminating economic inequality, or forget eliminating, we've been living in a period where it's been growing for the last half century. If you're interested in mitigating it, then anti-discrimination cannot be the kind of lodestone of your what I call the polar star thing you asked me about, of your politics. Your politics has to be actually a politics of mitigating, if not eliminating, class difference. Mm-hmm. So, I'm sure, as I say, we have no idea who this audience is like, and one can't predict. But in general, in a kind of liberal world now, we all understand. We all know we'll get into this, I'm sure, later on. We all know the meaning of the phrase racial reckoning. We all know what it is like to live in a society which is simultaneously racist and simultaneously committed to getting rid of racism. But where our real point is, one can succeed in all that. Not that we are, but one can succeed in all that and leave the economic structure of the society completely untouched. And since, in fact, as Adolph was just sort of saying before, it's the economic structure that's committed, first of all, to producing the racism of the late 19th and most of the 20th century. And we argue it's the economic structure of neoliberal capital that makes the same kind of use of the anti-racism of our period. We recognize that anti-racism is not really a weapon against the inequalities produced by capitalism. And what the point of the book is to argue not that we shouldn't be anti-racist, obviously we should continue to be anti-racist, but that in fact no amount of anti-racism will accomplish what we want. Right. And that it's only a kind of universalist commitment to redistribution that will begin to make a difference in the relation between the classes.
Yeah, I think there's a certain conditioning that happens where we're sort of, it seems like there's an attempt to train us to be okay with the way things are, as long as the situation is produced by markets and not by discrimination. And so,
Yeah, totally.
Yep.
I wonder if,
Yep.
to that point, if one of you could talk about the University of Michigan versus Bollinger case, just
Sure.
to talk about how neoliberalism has insinuated itself in modern life.
So I'll start that one, but I'll finish it. Because I did a little, it just occurred to me about 5 minutes before we started. So, of course, University of Michigan and Columbia, because Lee Bollinger has been ride or die for affirmative action and for the importance of race since he actually got into this business. There's a certain continuity there. So I don't want to disrespect Columbia. Actually, I believe Adolph's son got his PhD at Columbia. My son got 2 degrees at Columbia. My daughter went to Barton. So I'm a big fan of Columbia. I just thought to look a little before story. So this data is not totally up to date, but the median family income of students at Columbia is about a little over $150,000. 62% of the students at Columbia come from the top quintile of American income. So it's mainly rich kids. Look at the racial data. As it happens, by a fortunate for this broadcast coincidence, 62% of the students at Columbia are BIPOC. So let's look at what the model of social justice is there. The model of social justice is, and then this is the affirmative action model of social justice. So we're not worried here about like discrimination against Asians or discrimination against white people. We're just worried about what the social model of justice is. So it's easy to see what Columbia's model of social justice is. Columbia's model of social justice is we need a really good representation of minorities. Indeed, we're so committed to it, we're going to overrepresent minorities. So like, you know, white kids are like only 30%, so they're an underrepresented group. So we're committed to racial representation. But we have zero interest in what would be, as it were, an economic equivalent. We have zero interest in class representation. On the contrary, what we want is rich kids of color. So we're going to get, now that's obviously, there'll be lots of exceptions, and I can imagine everybody in the chat right away saying, oh, it's not me, whatever. But nonetheless, the data suggests that that is the way it is, even if it's not you individually. So part of the point then has been that we have produced a model, and the universities are an exemplary instance of doing this. And why are the universities important for this? Because universities are, at least in the kind of upper middle class imagination of American society, the mechanism of social mobility. Where you go to a university, you can succeed, you do well, and you got there by hard work and all that. So and that's been increasingly crucial because actually the universities have become more and more important in producing social mobility, or at least the fantasy of social mobility, just as American inequality has become worse and worse and worse. That is, again, over the last half century. So, you know, if you think about the role played by the university, the role played by the university is precisely to produce a certain fantasy of what social justice is. And that fantasy is that the rich people come in all different colors and that everybody has a chance to become rich. And it's actually completely obscured an alternative model of what social justice would be, which would be, no, it's actually not, you know, for the rich people to come in lots of different colors. It's for, you know, there to be fewer rich people, in an ideal world, like no rich people. So there's a way in which, you know, the university isn't the cause of the increased inequalities in American capitalism, but the value, the commitment we have to the university is a symptom of those increased inequalities, and the commitment to the idea that affirmative action, or more generally racial representation, would be a kind of solution to the problem, or at least a step in the right direction of solving the problem, is a symptom of the degree to which we think of racial proportions as exemplary of what social justice should be, and we are almost completely indifferent. Again, taking the university as our model, to the question of how class would work. And of course, we could never do it proportionally in terms of class, because for one thing, you know, like all those people could never afford to go to Columbia. And if they could afford to go to Columbia, or if Columbia would pay their way, they could never get into Columbia. And then beyond that, if they did get into Columbia, the whole point of Columbia would be to keep them from stopping being poor and to turn them into part of the elite. So the elite doesn't get better if it's more like multiracial, but the elite doesn't get any better if there's like more poor kids or originally poor kids in it either. the point of our politics, right, is not to make the elite more racially representative or more economically representative, but actually to get rid of the elite. So there's an important way in which a kind of class politics is completely opposed to anything the university can possibly do as an agent of social justice.
And I want to put some more data about inequality onto some of the dialogue that we were just, having. So I'm going to ask Camby's if he can pull up chart 1. Before we look at that, though, Adolph, is there anything that you wanted to add to what you just heard from Walter?
Well, I would just say that when Walter first started to make this argument, or when I first began to read it in the drafts of The Trouble with Diversity, I thought the logic is impeccable, and that the argument is like the line drawn through a scatter plot that makes sense of the trajectory of the data. But I thought that that rhetorically it could have been a little more nuanced, right?
I never heard that before.
Well, I think I mentioned it at the time once, gently.
Yeah.
But
no, I just mean the general criticism of it. It could be a little more nuanced.
Right. But in the intervening years, there's less and less need for nuance, because the logic has become increasingly unmediated as the reality. And I will add that at the super elite institutions now, there's even like a flim flam that's been added to the limited nature of or class nature of affirmative action programs, which is the first generation college student, right? Which is like a proxy for poor people. And what I've noticed at Penn and elsewhere, it also becomes clear that other students, good-hearted students, smart students, well-intended students, volunteer to help with their classmates, first-gen classmates, to accommodate them, right? To basically, I mean, nobody puts it like this, but to the class position that they're being incorporated into, right? And I mean, there was like a great Tracy Ullman skit years and years ago that touched on this at a private school in the UK. But the idea, but also for a generation or so prior to the first gen programs, there was this thing, I don't know if they're still around, but this program called A Better Chance, which would take kids from like the South Bronx and send them to prep school and then to Yale. And I knew a number of those students over the years and saw all the conflicts that they had between the objective of getting the FAT letter, which meant they can go back home and help their community, and getting the next, and then graduating and aspiring to the job at Morgan Stanley, and then how those got harmonized as graduating, taking a job at Morgan Stanley, which will equip you to go back home and help your community by killing all the public schools in it and replacing them with charters. So that's kind of where we are with this now.
Well, thank you for that. Let's get into its charts 1 and 2. Walter, if you want to take the lead here, these.
Well, just to make it fast, if you just look at like on the chart 1, the gaps in wealth, the second part of it, the gaps in wealth between upper income and middle and lower income rising, the share held by middle income families falling. I mean, just the easy way to make the point is look at the bottom part of it, 1983. So if you're one of the lower income, so median wealth, right, is family wealth is $12,300. This is all inflation adjusted. If you look at it, 2001, it's gone up a bit. If you look at it in 2016, this is of course in part a function of the Great Recession, it actually gone down. So you got the lower income group is not only not, as it were, kept pace with the upper income group, they've actually not kept pace with themselves. So if you tell them, yeah, the fundamental problem here is like racism and sexism, it's discrimination. So first of all, the majority of that group is like white people. You know, we have another graph later on. The majority of every, I mean, because it's a majority white country still, the majority of every group income group and wealth group is white people. So you look at the white people and you tell them, yeah, the big problem that we have of injustice in this country is discrimination. And these people are making 12,300. I mean, they're making 11,300. They own, they have 11,300 in 2016, and down from 12,300, 40 years before. They know perfectly well that either they know perfectly well the fundamental problem here is not discrimination, or they believe what Trump and others have told them, and that actually it's anti-white racism. That's the problem. That is, they buy into the idea that discrimination is real, but they decide it's anti-white discrimination. Obviously, it is not anti-white discrimination. It's not racism or sexism that has kept that figure from 12,300 to 11,300. It's capitalism that's kept that figure from 12,300 to 11,300. So and if you think about from their standpoint, just to connect it back up to the university, suppose you tell the white people down at the bottom, yeah, you've made no progress for the last half century. But actually, they're much more, don't you feel better about like a world in which if you look at Harvard, you look at Columbia, there's still like a bunch of white people going to Harvard or Columbia.
Right.
You say, I mean, when has it ever been the case that poor white people were expected to be kind of like proud of the fact that there were a bunch of rich white people at Harvard and Columbia? But of course, we completely imagine, because a lot of those poor people are also Black, that we say to the poor Black people, yeah, I mean, it's true that for most of you, things have not gotten better. And actually, things have not improved for most Black people since 1968. For most of you, things have not gotten better. But look, we have increased representation at Harvard and Columbia. Why should we expect them to be happy? Don't expect the white guys to say, well, it's true, things suck for me. But on the other hand, look at my white brothers at Goldman Sachs. It's unclear why we should expect Black people to fall for a line which is completely uncompelling for white people. Yeah, things suck for you, but on the other hand, your Black brothers are at Goldman Sachs. So part of the point has been just to sort of see the degree to which, in a period when many people in the US have actually gone backwards, most people in the US have barely stayed still, and some people in the US have made extraordinary strides. We should be focused on thinking not that we should eliminate these gaps, that those numbers should look differently. We've been focused instead on worrying about the racial proportions of the people who inhabit those different strata. So the first point of this graph in general is just to say that it's not unimportant that the rise of identitarianism and the rise of anti-discrimination as the kind of fulcrum of social justice has taken place at a time in which actually American inequality has been increasing, and in which the mechanisms by which it's been increasing have almost nothing to do with race, and have everything and nothing to do with racism, and everything to do not with classism, which is a false neologism, but everything to do with capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Let's advance to the next set of charts, tracking race. Let's talk through these, looking at how the disproportionate distribution of wealth, how pronounced it is.
Adolph, you should tell about the white wealth stuff.
Well, yeah, I want to make a couple points about this. Oh, and in fact, one thing I want to do is pick up on the anomaly that, or an anomaly that Walter just mentioned, that we don't. Why do we not imagine that a poor white person should be happy and fulfilled by the fact that rich white people are getting richer, but we assume that a poor Black person or poor Black people should be? And I think the one answer to that is racism. And some people might find it queer for me to toss the charge out there, but a particular kind of racism, which is one that again goes back at least to the late 19th century. But the notion that all Black people share the same brain, share the same objectives, and social concerns, right? And this is the population of Black Americans is larger than the total population of Canada, right? So, but this is a premise that the discourse of racial disparity hinges on, right? Because when you make these comparisons of the amount of wealth that the average Black person holds and the amount of wealth that the average white person holds. Well, there are two fictions there. There's no average black person and there's no average white person, right? And I mean, you need to look at a wealth as it's stratified, right? By income group, right? And who possesses it. Turns out Matt Breinig's work at the Progressive Policy Project has found that, lo and behold, more than 70% of so-called white wealth is held by the 10% richest white people, or the richest 10% of white people, and upwards of 70% of black wealth, of so-called black wealth, is held by the richest 10% of black people. And when you look at the bottom 50% of blacks and whites, they basically have the same amount of wealth, which is zero. But if you correct for if you resolve whatever racial wealth gap would persist among the bottom 50% of blacks and whites, still 97% of the so-called racial wealth gap would remain. But just as another kind of thought experiment that sort of punctuates the essential racist presumptions that underlie the narrative about the racial wealth gap, is like what I'm saying this lately too, like posit a white nurse, single mother or not, as the case may be, homeowner or renter, it doesn't matter. She lost her job, I'd say during COVID. She's on the verge of either being evicted or being foreclosed on. Do we imagine that there's a pot of racial wealth that she can go to and apply for an advance to help her make the mortgage, or say maybe, take a teacup like the Elon Musk's house and like ask for disbursement from his share of white wealth? Of course we don't. So I mean, the whole notion is preposterous ultimately, and it's preposterous except in one sense, that it reduces to a class program, because once we take into account who actually owns wealth in this country, narrowing the racial wealth gap then is only a program for closing the gap between rich black people and rich white people. And it leaves the rest of us out of the mix entirely. And from that perspective, it's kind of fascinating to see how quickly we've gone from killing of Michael Brown and the killing of George Floyd, from calls for defunding the police or for police reform or whatever, based on a premise that all black and brown people suffer equally from the danger of being killed by cops, to a single-minded focus on a political program now that contains two linked components, one of which is reparations, which is something else to talk about, I suppose, but the other of which is narrowing the racial wealth gap, which I've just pointed out is a class program. And again, I'll just say it for like the 15th time, or at least it feels like it, that the presumption that trickle-down social policy works for black people when we know it doesn't work for anybody else is quintessentially racist.
So can I just say, that's exactly right, I think. And it goes back to something you said at the beginning, we talked about people who are generally committed to social justice. I mean, a way of putting the point would be, if your idea of social justice is eliminating the racial wealth gap disparity, your idea of social justice is basically a fundamentally conservative idea of social justice. That is, it's a class program. It's a class program which will actually preserve the differences between the rich and the poor, but just make sure that the proportions are done differently. So, I mean, it is kind of an irony that you would say the kind of hegemonic commitment of American liberalism today is to the idea of racial disparity and the attempt to overcome racial disparity. And it's not that there is no such thing as racial disparity. There certainly is. That's what makes us so effective. But that actually, were it to be successful in overcoming racial disparity, since you would make no contribution to overcoming economic disparity as such, the fundamental kind of hegemonic liberal idea is a fundamentally, from the standpoint of the critique of capitalism, conservative idea, which means that the people who are, I'm not criticizing anybody's intentions or anybody's sincerity, but what they're sincerely committed to is the replication of a capitalist system which is fundamentally unjust. And every time the problem of racial disparity comes out of their mouths, they're reasserting that commitment. That's supposed to be the uncomfortable part.
Right.
And this is the last chart that you brought with you, looking at job prospects. If we could just briefly touch on this, and then I'll go to questions because we have a lot of them.
Okay.
Yeah. So one reason. You want to go first? Go ahead.
Yeah. Except I want to go back to the other chart that I didn't comment on, which is, but the key point is, yeah, if you look at the color-coded chart, what you see is that white people are preponderant, are a sizable majority in every category from the bottom to the top, right? And I know that some of the mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow types have a convenient way to sidestep that reality, but by flippantly saying that the whites are just collateral damage of what's fundamentally a racist system. But like I'm sure Columbia freshmen couldn't get away with making a claim that in a logic course. I'm done,
Yeah.
Walter.
So if we look at the other one, just the point to make was, if you think about, it goes back to the kind of question of what it means to have a class politics. If you look at that list, those are the list. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out the list of fastest growing jobs. And to simplify it, every year, ever since I started looking at these, which is maybe now 15 years now, the top fastest growing job has been home health and personal care aides. Yeah. And as you see, the median annual wage in 2021 is $29,430. You can't live on that, much less live on that with a child or someone in your family who can't work. So part of the point is going to be is that if you look at that from a racial or gender perspective, it's the case by this, and we all know the reasons. That is, home health aides and personal care aides are overwhelmingly women, and they're largely women of color. So there's just two ways of thinking about how to solve this problem. One would be to say as well, in a more just world, women of color would have an opportunity to escape the job of being a home health or a personal care aide. And that what justice consists in, and this is the fundamental anti-discrimination model, is giving those people the possibility to actually rise and be like, look at one of the comparatively few, but nonetheless real, better paying jobs on this list, like software developers, or farther on down the line, nurse practitioners. So what if you did that? Well, you did that, you would change things considerably for the women who were able to escape those jobs. But the model precisely is not the model of a class politics. It's the model of an ability to escape from your class, the model of class mobility. Now, if you think of it alternatively, you think, okay, the problem here is that the largest growing job in the US, Obama used to say, let all the kids learn to code. If all the kids learn to code, a few of them, and you can see from that chart, a very few of them will become software developers. Most of the kids who learn to code will still be home health and personal care aides.
Right.
So you want to say, okay, from the standpoint of social justice, from an economic perspective, maybe the answer is not to try to make it so that everybody has an equal opportunity of bad jobs. Maybe the goal is to make those bad jobs into good jobs, or at least to make them into better jobs. You would help everybody if instead of making $29,000, for $29,430, those home health and personal care aides were making $58,000 or $78,000 or $100,000. You wouldn't have to worry so much about whether people had a chance to escape those jobs or not. What you'd be thinking about is, no, those jobs ought to pay better, and maybe some other jobs ought to pay worse. But our model, again, the racial disparity model or the proportional representation model, the model that's in force in American liberalism, leaves those jobs bad and just thinks that justice is a chance to stop doing those jobs. And the argument we're trying to make in the book is to say that actually makes no significant difference in the fundamental structure of society. What you want to do is take those jobs, those growing jobs, and make those jobs better. That has nothing to do, we don't have to care about the race or the gender of the person who holds the jobs. We have to care about the job itself. And the last slide is just to dramatize again. I mean, I always like to put this one up just because, like, it's worthwhile remembering that that line at the very bottom that's going nowhere is half the population.
Right. Yep. I'm just a little point of punctuation, but in our conclusion, we note that the median hourly wage for a for a white male home healthcare worker is $14.42, where the median hourly wage for a Black woman doing the same job is $12.84. So if we could close that gap so that the Black woman is also making $14.42, well, they're still below the poverty line, both of them.
Thank you for that. Let me go to some questions. We have a lot of great ones here. Eric Horn asks, what would it take in specific concrete terms to address the economic inequality that you described?
Adolph goes first.
Well, yeah, I just say, political will, right? I mean, look, I worked in both Sanders campaigns, and 20 years before the Sanders or the second one, well, both of them actually. I worked with the Labor Party, where we actually developed a platform for free public higher education, and we learned how laughably cheap the total tuition bill of all public colleges and universities it is in the U.S. It's probably about $100 billion now, but that's like a rounding error for corporate welfare, right? Tips for the cab ride home, right? For Raytheon, right? So it takes political will, right? But the only way we get the political will, right, is through through organizing among the people who are affected, getting the bottom or the fuzzy end of the lollipop. And not only, obviously, but including those white people, right, who feel that the Democrats or liberals haven't done anything for them in 40 years, and not incorrectly, and feel the contempt coming from the Clintonites and others, and we need to build a majoritarian political movement that's oriented toward advancing the position of the working class and expanding social wage policy, like in a way we haven't done in my lifetime.
How do you think that Bernie Sanders helped advance the mainstream buy-in to what had been, not a terribly popular notion within traditional Democratic politics?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. And I mean, I have no criticism of Sanders at all. But I think where the campaign was maybe more successful was in identifying or in rallying people who have the potential to and interest in being organizers to work in concert to pursue or to build a movement that's going to be necessary to pursue these objectives. I mean, you can't do it through on the winning elections. And I think one of the problems that we have now, and this wasn't Sanders' fault, but people who came into politics through his election campaign often brought a schoolhouse rock kind of understanding of how like electoral politics works. And I mean, the Justice Democrats' approach, for instance, is very limited, right? It's limited to winning districts that are already heavily blue and tilt left, and but they may be available for demographic reasons. And you can't go very far like that. There's no way around connecting with working people who are actually hurting out there, both to, my good friend, Tony Mazzocchi, a longtime leader of the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, said often that democratic liberalism can't deliver to address people's needs and concerns and fears. And if we can't find a way, we as the left or whatever we are, can't find a way to connect with those people and to articulate or to give them like explanations, plausible explanations of what's a pickpocket operation and what isn't, and then struggle with them around matters that they're concerned about, to develop political organizations and a movement that's strong enough to challenge for the policies that we want. Other much more dangerous forces out there are going to fill the breach, basically. And I mean, Tony Mazzocchi died in 2002, so I mean that was a while ago. But it's been clear for a long time that festering resentment out there it is a problem, and it's fascinating to see, as Walter said, how just as racism was an obfuscatory tool of capitalism, 100 years ago, anti-racism often works the same way for capitalism now.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's no way around building a movement. Sorry.
No, in a way, just to put the point sharply for what's likely to go on next week or two, to come back to the university thing, is that a thing to do is, like, if you actually are genuinely committed to social justice, stop caring how the affirmative action thing comes out. It's two different ways of organizing an unjust system. Well, if you think of all the editorials you're going to read, of all the rallies you're going to hear about, of all things you're going to go to about affirmative action over the next 2 weeks, then think instead, no, what we want to do is decommodify healthcare. Decommodifying healthcare makes a huge difference to everybody right away, including raising the salaries of all those health. Decommodify education, decommodify housing, or an actual commitment to public housing. Those are all, every single one of those things, even minimal success in the right direction of those things, goes more to achieve social justice in the U.S. than whichever side you're on, thinking about who's being discriminated against at Harvard and Columbia.
And also to look at this from the standpoint of Black politics, but I'll just note, and she's probably tired of hearing me do this, but she already defended her dissertation and she hasn't told me she's tired yet. But my penultimate, I'm a dissertation advisor, when she was a first semester grad student, took my Black American Political Thought course, and she led readings, a massive readings done from the mid-30s to the mid-40s. And it wasn't an area that she worked in before, but she noted at the beginning of her comments that no one whom we read during that period talked about the need to fight racism. And we're talking about people like Pauli Murray and A. Philip Randolph and E. Franklin Frazier, Oliver Cromwell Cox, but they all fought for and against specific programs and policy visions, right? And the transition, right, that's occurred since the Voting Rights Act, right, to the understanding of what Black politics is about, is combating some abstraction called racism, rather than fighting for or against specific programs and policies, is sort of comparable to anti-terrorism, like in the sense that it's an enemy that can't be identified, it doesn't live anywhere, you can never defeat it, but it doesn't go away. But it also doesn't help you get anywhere. Like, it doesn't explain anything. Saying, and see, this is another problem with the disparities discourse. And my colleague, who is now a Columbia history and public health professor, Merlin Chalkwanian, and I did an article a decade ago that examined disparities discourse. And one of the things that struck us was that there are no recommendations in that literature, right? Or I mean, the recommendations have to do with reducing disparities, but there's no causal account either, right? The causal account of disparities is always racism, but racism doesn't explain anything, not in concrete terms. It's a meta ideological account, but it doesn't tell us, for instance, how housing inequality is reproduced on a daily basis, or how income inequality is reproduced on a daily basis. It's an alternative to an explanation, and to that extent, I think that betrays the degree to which what we think of as Black politics at this point is also a class politics, and not a working class politics.
Dr. Deborah Myers asks, what if racism is an intentional process to hoard opportunities and resources for one group and exclude them from others? What if white supremacy was invented to place those who believe themselves to be white at the top of the hierarchy for power and privilege? Thoughts?
Walter?
Well, the first answer is like there are a lot of white people who are not at the top of the hierarchy. I mean,
right.
We could agree with a lot of that question. There's no question that, it used to be a kind of truism on the left. What was the point of white supremacy? Anybody who works in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s was to divide and conquer. So yeah, it absolutely was. Great article by the great historian Judith Stein called The Political Economy of Jim Crow, which gives a very concrete example, which bears out exactly what the questioner says. That is, yeah, a bunch of white people deploying racism very intentionally. They also believed it. They're true believers, but they could see what it could do for them. But you want to say is that those people are not, as it were, white people. The whole point of that graph back before, the one that Adolph was talking about, it's white people majority all the way down. The white people at the bottom would say, if you tell them that the basic engine of injustice in this country today is white supremacy, they're going to look at you. They're not going to believe you. White supremacy hasn't done anything for them. White supremacy has left them where they were. So you want to say yes to one part of that question. There is something intentional, and there is something absolutely hoarding not just opportunities, but the actual things that go beyond opportunities, the actual capital.
Ted Botner asks, why are progressive professional management class activists primarily focused on identity politics and race/gender disparities instead of universal social democratic reforms? Is this because they can't see beyond their own class foundations?
Well, that's an interesting question too. The short answer is because that's how they eat.
So again, I mean, the question, it depends who you mean by the sort of progressive. I mean, insofar as the progressive model is the human resources model, it just literally is both the long and short answer. That's what they're paid to do. That is, they're paid to make sure that workforces function fairly, and where fairly means without discrimination. Insofar as what means progressive activists who are, insofar as the question is, why are progressive activists replicating HR? Why has the social justice of the HR company, segment of every major corporation become a model for political justice? Yeah, I think that actually the questioner gave the answer. That is a function of a class position, and it is a class interest, but it's not. Again, it's important to see about class interests. It doesn't mean that the beliefs aren't sincerely held.
Yeah, sure.
It doesn't mean,
Great. Yeah. Sean asks, he says, you too are known as critics of identity politics, even though you rarely use that term. Does focusing the critique on, quote, anti-racism risk conflating different conceptions of anti-racism that really ought to be distinguished, such as identitarian versus universalist?
Well, look, I'll say this, and this isn't directed at the questioner, but like we've seen for decades now, the following kind of rhetorical move. I've seen it from postmodernists, I've seen it from the anti-racist and others. And defenders of rap music and of hip hop as a genuinely revolutionary politics. That when you point to the expressions of whatever the phenomenon is that we're all familiar with, right? And then the response is, well, it's true that there are those, but there's some rapper out off the coast of Long Island who is like a gay feminist rapper who's like carries a real spirit of hip hop, right? Not the people who who operate with the dominant ideology. I mean, but I think that we focus on anti-racism because that's one of the dominant expressions of identitarian discourse, and like this is also like an old canard, well, I won't say canard, but an old kind of rhetorical move to say that, well, to invent a notion that seems to combine both like the anti-race or both the identitarian separatist and the anti-racial and the universalist, right, premises, like the notion of racial, bless you, but like the notion of racial capitalism, for instance, is often what people point to as a kind of good universalist anti-racism that we don't pay attention to. Well, we don't pay attention to it, or at least I don't, because I've read enough of it. I don't think there's anything there. So it's kind of like white supremacy was for the planter class, like in the 1890s. It's a cover story, right? It's an effort to more or less conscious, more or less ingenuous, but it's nonetheless an attempt to sidestep the contradiction instead of trying to resolve it. And I mean, as has been the case with, like, the cultural turn, like in the academy since the mid 80s, a circle is a circle and a square is a square, and you can't square the circle.
The only thing I would sort of add to that, again, in the spirit of the question, is that, if you complain, I mean, we use the term identitarianism a lot, and I was using it way back in the 90s just to talk about the 20s. But,
yeah.
Today, just as there's a kind of, let's say, extraordinarily obsessive identitarianism on the so-called left, there's a kind of like rabid anti-identitarianism identified as like where woke goes to die, kind of DeSantis stuff on the right. And, our point is not that the problem is the successive commitment to identity. That's why I actually don't use the term identity politics. If I can avoid it. Sometimes people use it for me in titles. Mm-hmm. It's really something we all agree on. So take the universalist anti-racism that the questioner talks about. Well, we're all kind of committed to that. I mean, it's the default position. No one, when I talked about the logic of HR, no one thinks the company would be better run if you didn't actually enforce anti-discrimination in the company. You totally should enforce anti-discrimination in the company. So what we want to be saying is to move from anti-identitarianism to anti-racism, or really more generally to anti-discrimination, is to say, look, anti-discrimination is not in itself a bad thing, just the opposite.
Right.
Anti-discrimination is in itself a good thing. Anti-discrimination on its own, or anti-discrimination as the lead, as the kind of, again, the polar star of your social justice, that is the logic of neoliberal morality. It's better to be neoliberally moral than it is to be neoliberally immoral, right? It's better to enforce those things in your company, in your workplace, and wherever it is. But they don't address the question of capitalism at all. So part of the point is to say, absolutely, we should all be anti-racist, but if we're actually thinking about what it is that produces the fundamental problems of society today, our anti-racism doesn't solve that problem. So, in a way, we want to distinguish ourselves from the kind of hysterics of anti-wokeism, because, truthfully, we don't have a position. There is no form of discrimination, even the most minute, that we're not. I'm sure I speak for Adolph in this. We're not prepared to oppose, and oppose strongly. Right? It's not like we're defending discrimination. The point's going to be to say, yeah, but doing that is a way of sort of accommodating and living in the world we live in, and making sure that, the trans person down the hall gets treated just as fairly as the Black person on the other side of the hall. That's absolutely essential. But if there goes back to a point Adolph made before, if the way they're getting treated fairly is that one of them is no longer making $14 an hour or $12 an hour, and now she's making $14 an hour, they're both getting fucked. Neither one of them is being treated fairly. And what you need is a politics that precisely goes beyond anti-discrimination. Comes before and then comes after. So the point really is, you don't want to reduce the kind of politics to a kind of anti-identitarianism. You want to reduce it to the limitations of the politics. It's a phrase Adolph used really right from the start, the limits of anti-racism. But the limits of anti-racism, which seemed to us like maybe 15 years ago, limits, now seem to us to say, no, there's a way in which anti-racism has no limits. It's at the heart of a certain model of social justice, and it's the heart of a defense of social injustice.
Yep.
Alan asks, to what degree, if any, can we form a positive conception of social and or cultural diversity apart from race?
This is where you'd like to have him here, so I give an example of what he meant. So I actually don't know what he means.
Right.
Alan, feel free to elaborate and I'll return to your question. Let's see, we've got a lot here. This is from an anonymous attendee. What do you think of the controversy regarding Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia's recent change in admission policy and the lawsuits filed by a mostly Asian American group as being discriminatory? Let me know if you're not familiar with this case. Similar,
I'm not.
Harvard admission policy lawsuits currently in SCOTUS's hands, and we're all awaiting that decision.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know the Jefferson case, but if it's similar to the Harvard thing, what I'm really saying is we should stop all awaiting that decision. If you're actually committed to social justice, you should think whatever that decision is, it's just going to give us one of two different models of how to do economic hierarchy. And what we should be committed to is undoing the economic hierarchy, not figuring out whether there's the right number of Asians who have an opportunity to go to the top of it. So, I get that. I mean, we all know these matter to us on a local level. We all had, I don't know what the age of you are, but Adolph and I have had kids, grandkids, whatever, have gone to college, gone to high school, gone to these things, and they're matters of great interest to us individually. But the question of whether, the right number, what the right number of Asians is to be at Harvard is a question of no political interest from the standpoint of the left at all. It does not matter. So I just don't care how the affirmative action thing comes out. The real problem you've got is sitting around waiting to see how it comes out. And if you do really care how it comes out, you're not on the left.
And I would just, and the mine also, but I would just add at this point, the only reason I'm frankly concerned about the affirmative action cases is the potential for the other side to mobilize around them politically. And I think that's pretty dangerous. But, and I mean, they've been doing it, right, obviously.
Another question from an anonymous attendee. Can the speakers please react to the following thesis? Society is based on social hierarchy. The forces behind the hierarchy are pernicious and ever changeable, but hierarchy itself is inherent in humanity. Or put another way, if economic equality magically appeared, society would quickly shift to a hierarchy based on something, and that hierarchy may continuously change.
Well, I have two things to say to that. One is, I thought that Bill Buckley was dead. Two is that I went to Catholic school through high school, and I had catechism for 12 years. And I know a catechism when I hear it, and I just don't accept the premise.
Anything to add, Walter?
I was a good answer. I mean, I don't have the Catholic school catechism as part of my background in this. The only thing I would say, I basically just completely agree with Adolph. And my one line thing would be is that, okay, if everybody had health care, everybody had all the money they needed to live, and everybody had all the things they actually think of as belonging to the common good, then the fact that some people thought they were better than other people, wouldn't actually be that big an issue for me,
Right.
So the question is how consequential those hierarchies are. And the whole point of the kind of hypothetical, right, is if everybody actually is guaranteed access to all those things, then the hierarchies become a lot less pernicious, although they might, of course, always be irritating to people who aren't on the right side of
them. Let's see here. Francis asks, wait, forgive me here. I'm just going through these. There's a lot. I haven't read all of them yet, but Chico, Chico asks, do you two think that there is anything wrong with being in favor of encouraging hardworking kids who, to use the Chinese phrase, think it's glorious to become rich?
Well, I wouldn't want to encourage my kid to think it's glorious to become rich, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you guys touched on it with the Morgan Stanley example earlier.
Right. Good point.
And I'm proud to say, but I am proud to say that despite having gone to Columbia and Barnard, neither of my children succeeded in coming anywhere near close to being rich. So at least there, I'm living my dream there.
Oh yeah, me too.
Another one, how do you deal with people who focus on capitalism being called communist? The argument that focusing on capitalism means you are a communist and communism is then understood as authoritarianism, etc.
Well, I mean, that's one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's one I've been around all my life. And one thing we need to understand is that communism, and what this comes through nicely in the Grapes of Wrath, actually, where a grower, I think, says that his idea of a red is any son of a bitch who demands 6 bits a day when the boss wants to pay $1, right? Every movement to improve the condition of working people in this country for the last century and a half, practically, has been castigated as being communist. So it's kind of the cost of doing business. But the way that I've dealt with it, and the way I know a lot of other people have dealt with it, is to refuse to deal with the moralizing abstractions that people throw around and just stick to the program, right? I mean, we had a campaign within the Labor Party coming out of our founding convention calling for a 28th Amendment to guarantee every resident the right to a job and a living wage. And I made a presentation to a student group someplace, and the guy said he felt I was being disingenuous because I wasn't calling it socialism. And I said, look, you can call it what you want, right? But the fact is there are 2 very simple propositions here. One is that everyone who's willing and able to work should be able to have a job. And the other is that everyone who works a job should expect to earn enough to live on. Now, you can call that communism if you want, you can call it capitalism if you want, but that's really what the deal is. So for us, look, the opposition is going to attack and to demonize people who propose the kind of politics that we propose, because there are stakes here, right? I mean, this isn't Schoolhouse Rock, right? I mean, there are stakes that involve property, wealth, and power. And the only way that we can change the terms of political debate is to organize people in a large enough mass and forceful enough mass to put pressure on the system. It's interesting in that respect. Progressives, leftists, got more from Richard Nixon in his presidency than we've gotten from certainly the next 3, Democratic presidents. I think the jury maybe still out on Biden, but Biden seems kind of committed to blowing up the entire world anyway. But Nixon, why? It's not because Nixon liked us. It's because the movements that carried our interests forward are strong enough then that anybody who was in the White House or who was in Congress had to respond to them and make concessions, right? And the one thing I want to add to that too, is that going back to my former grad student, who is now a PhD, that from the mid-30s through the 50s, and Preston Smith, a political scientist at Mount Holyoke, has done really great work on this topic. But what Black activists, right, Black political agents, right, civic elites, came together around a conviction that while segregation had to go, and while all forms of discrimination had to go, and they fought tediously, right, tirelessly for it, they also understood and asserted repeatedly that necessary conditions for Black Americans' advancement were expansion of social wage policy nationally and expansion of the industrial trade union movement, partly because they understood that most Black people are working class, and what advances the interests of the working class, by definition, like advance the interests of those Black people. Partly because also, and especially after World War II, they understood that the economy was undergoing a structural reorganization, and much Black economic inequality, probably most of it, even by the 1950s, had less to do with discrimination than it did with economic change and automation, as they called it then. And they were convinced of that also because Black people have been between 10 and 13% of the American population. And in a majoritarian democracy, you can't win like that. And we need allies who are in the same position and whose interests overlap with ours to the extent that we can work concertedly. And so this is another giveaway, right? Like about, disparitarian ideology, because insofar as it's not concerned, and this is true about the reparation stuff too, insofar as it's not concerned with trying to build a majoritarian democracy within the country, right? Its understanding of who the natural allies of this politics are the nonprofit sector and the governing class, right? And that's another reason that we can say that anti-racism is the beating heart of neoliberalism. And what I'm here again, right? 2015 and 2016 were a watershed moment for exposing this politics, right? Because the Black political class's reaction to the Sanders campaign almost universally was hostile and antagonistic and frankly dishonest, right? Even as I think as late as December 2016 or 15, I forget which now. Black Americans in opinion polls showed support for Sanders at higher, Black Democrats showed support for Sanders at higher levels than any other groups in the Democratic Party, right? So you've got this tension here, right? Between a disproportionately working class Black population that can be inclined, I think, just like the working class white population, if they're able to give a fair hearing to a program like the Sanders program or like our kind of politics, they'll support it. And I mean, that's been my experience, like in talking to Black trade union members too. So why all hostility against Sanders? Well, it's partly because a universalist program, right, would deliver benefits to Black people that don't come through the brokerage class, basically, right? But also their fundamental commitment, what that class's fundamental political commitment is to multiracial neoliberalism. So like so in that sense, it's a matter of like drawing a clear, well, not even drawing, following the clear line in the dirt that the other side has drawn.
All right, well, I'm gonna leave
I agree with all that.
Thank you.
I'm gonna leave it there because we are out of time. I want to let
okay.
the audience know that we're gonna be sharing this recording within the next 24 hours. And there's going to also be a link in the email that you receive, a link to the book and the discount code. It's called No Politics But Class Politics. It's a great read, a really interesting collection of essays. I thank Drs. Reed and Dr. Michaels for being here tonight. Well, it's today where I am here on the West Coast, but for being here with me tonight. I so appreciate this. And I'm sorry I didn't get to all of the questions in the Q&A, but I hope we covered a good bit of them, and I think we covered a lot of ground. So thanks very much to both of you and to everybody who joined us.
Thank you. Yep. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So long.